So everyone, today I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Yanjun Gao, and she currently is a research associate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and working in the ICU Data Science Lab, Department of Medicine and School of Medicine and Public Health. She obtained PhD in computer science and focusing on natural language processing in the AI in NLP lab at Penn State. And her research areas include natural language generation, semantic representation, summarization, evaluation, graph-based NLP, and last but not least, large language models and its applications in Gen AI and in healthcare. So without much further ado, let me turn the stage to Dr. Gao, and we'll hear her excellent research in this presentation.
Yeah, I think I did it. All right. Do you want to? Yeah. So hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today to talk about the research that we've been doing at Wisconsin-Madison. So just a little bit of background. I did my PhD in NLP in general domain, but during my postdoc, I actually started doing research for like NLP for healthcare, and in particular for clinical NLP. So today I'm going to talk about the large language models, which is one of the most popular topics nowadays. And in particular, I want to talk about the medical knowledge grounding for diagnosis prediction. And another little bit of background about what is mean of grounding. So grounding in computer science and also computer linguistics represent when you have symbolic representation about the world. Then like you can use this symbolic representation into fit into the models so that it knows, like has the word knowledge so that it can perform something like common sense reasoning, or like in the robotics area, they're able to pick up something and then drop it down somewhere. So those concepts are about grounding. But what I'm going to talk about today is in particular how we're going to feed this or inject this medical knowledge from a knowledge base and then into large language model. So to start my talk, I want to show you this figure, which some of you might be really familiar with. So this is the EPIC interface, EPIC EHR interface, electronic health records. Like EPIC, as you know, is one of the largest EHR system provider in the United States. So the reason I'm showing out this figure is to show you that for a patient, there are tons of EHR information about that patient, describing each visit, each encounter, and then each encounter will generate different nodes, including different node types. And then within each node type, you're going to see like the language that's in structured representation, which is like structured data, numbers, or other numerical representation. You're also going to see the narratives, which is natural language. For example, like the sentence and the assessment and plan. Like some of them might be like in a sentence structure. Some of them might just like be small phrases or compound words. So one of the main motivation of having this EHR is to help to optimize the clinician's workflow. However, it brings more troubles than just convenience to the clinicians. So I'm going to quote a study from the Lancet Respiratory Medicine published in 2020, where they interview a group of clinicians from different departments, asking them how they felt about the utilization of EHR and whether EHR really helped them improve their daily workflow. So one of the main concerns they get is the what is the most important information about that given patient and where to find this information? So which is what I highlighted in this figure. While EHR provides so much information, but the trouble of information overload brought by the EHR is actually considered to be one of the main factors that causing clinicians burnout. So here I'm also quoting a figure from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, AHRQ. Some of you might also really familiar with. And you can see that EHR is listed as one of the major factors for clinicians burnout. And I also like to point out another bad consequence about clinicians burnout is the medical errors, which include, for example, diagnostic errors. And on the other hand, we currently enter a new era in NLP, which is the era of large language models. I'm showing you this landscape of the large language models and to show you why there are tons of different models out there developed by different companies. For example, you might be really familiar with everybody knows about OpenAI or Google or Microsoft. And some of you might know like Anthropic, which is a company that focusing on the interpretability inside the large language models. There are also different applications from these LLMs, for example, text generation, classification, knowledge answering, or translation. In the area of applying NLP methods to EHR data, which is what we call the clinical NLP, like the efforts of like utilizing these NLP methods to analyze or help to synthesize the EHR data has been going well since like almost 2 decades ago. And that's thanks to a major reason contribute to the growing of this field is because of the publicly available EHR dataset. Because as we know, the EHR dataset is really private, it's really sensitive. It contains PHI data. So therefore, it makes a huge effort to actually make them publicly available. So Mimic is one of the famous EHR publicly available datasets out there. And since the release of Mimic, it actually stimulates all kinds of collaborations across domain. For example, like the National NLP Clinical Challenge, NTC2, it's one of the longest shared tasks that some of the tasks built on top of Mimic and other public data sets. And it actually brings together the group of physicians, clinical informaticians, and then also computer scientists together and trying to use NLP method to solve one particular clinical problems. And now we might wonder, since the beginning of we have like these NLP methods and also the application of NLP to the clinical data set or EHR data, then what has been going on in this field? What has been people focusing on? So what you're looking at right now, it's a figure from our paper about a scoping review on all the publicly available clinical language tasks. And then you can look at the different types of clinical problems they're solving. And then you can see there's a long list of these tasks. Each one of them has a really low frequency, but they're solving one particular clinical problems. So these include, for example, PHI de-identification, phenotyping, or classifying whether a patient has obesity or whether they have the risk factors for heart disease or other disease. These are the commonly seen clinical applications. While there are almost 60% of the tasks focus on like just general, non-specific. So what does that mean? That means that there are almost 60% of the clinical NLP tasks, they're not trying to solve any clinical problem. They're just being proposed as like a method or fundamental step to help to develop more advanced language models. So now we might raise a question, well, if our goal is trying to get a language model or NLP method that will be able to applied at the bedside, for example, to support the clinician's decision making, then what do we need? What do we really need to see from this task? So that's where we identify the gap between the superpower language models and the generic language task, for example, translation, summarization, classification, and also what is the real need for the clinical decision support systems. And here in this work, we identify one particular area that where NLP method can help, which is the diagnostic decision support. And now I just want to segue for one slide to say that there are like new type of tasks coming out in terms of clinical NLP. So what I'm showing you is the Bio NLP workshop, which is one of the largest workshop trying to apply NLP methods to biomedical data. And this year's Bio NLP workshop representing the trend of the current age that we're all looking at something that's lining towards generative AI, because you can see that all 3 tasks is focused on summarization, and 2 of them it's about EHR summarization. So one is our task on the task that our lab proposed on the problem list summarization, which we're going to get to. And the other is the multimodal radiology report summarization. So the second task is on the biomedical research articles. So it's more like a biomedical literature summarization, not in particular on the EHR. And now I want to focus on the task that we propose, because I do think that that represents a possibility of applying large language models for clinical decision support. The idea for the ProbSum task, problem list summarization, is that given the patient's progress note, so a progress note is a EHR document that have the patient's daily progress. And then we're trying to train or trying to get a language model to generate or summarize the patient's active problems given that progress note. And you can imagine that the benefit of doing that, the benefit of having a LLM to be able to do that task is that when the patient's problem is getting worse and worse, in particular in the ICU setting, for example, where repeat decision is really needed, and you can imagine like the daily progress note would be updated every an hour. Sometimes it would be even like every half an hour. Then when a physician come to the ICU during the morning shift, like how would they be able to catch up with all the updates? And then given like especially think about a scenario during COVID, if you are in the COVID ICU, you're seeing a patient dying in front of you, but you need to quickly assemble what's happening in the past 24 hours or even past 48 hours. So would it be nice if you have an LLM that summarize the major active problems for you and also listing out the evidence why they think that's the diagnosis? Then you'll be able to quickly tell, oh, these are the things that I should focus on right now. And that's the things that I should prescribe treatments for. So that's the main motivations why we need to have this ProbSum task and why we select to focus on this task. And now I want to show you another example. Oh, I hope that my bar goes away. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so that you can look at this example. So I'm using a fake example, but the fake example is just a fake patient, but it does make sense for the medical conditions. I use that fake example and I ask ChatGPT, give me the list of diagnoses. And then you can see that like ChatGPT actually generate quite good list of diagnoses. Some of them really make sense, right? Like sepsis, or aspiration pneumonia, or like COPD exacerbation, or hyperGI bleed. These are the active problems the patient is having. But why not just take ChatGPT and run it at the bedside and just take the diagnosis? Now I want to quote I want to show you this quote. Some of you might familiar with from Donald Rumsfeld. This is actually a quote that when he was commenting about like 911 events, but I was using it. I think this is a perfect quote for the LLM, which is there are so many things that we don't know that we don't know. There are definitely many things that we know that we know. There are many things that we know that we don't know, but there are unknowns about LLMs. Like we don't know how they work. We don't know what's the mechanics behind them. We don't know how they conclude the decisions or whether this decision is really reliable. To keep this code in mind, I want to say that I want to summarize the major threats of using this LLM in the hospital for you, which include, well, LLM hallucination. So many of you might know that hallucination is a major problem in this like large language model because there's no way that you can control what they're going to say. And they might, like for the things that they don't know, sometimes they would not be honest about like the fact that they don't know. They would just make up something and then they would sound really convincing. So that is a major problem. Think about it if you want to apply it in the hospital. And the second problem is about the cost of running them. If you want to have a GPT scale LLM that's running at the bedside and then you pre-train it using tons of EHR data, unless you have a farms of a GPU, I don't think you'll be able to do that. And not even talk about, not just about the ChatGPT scale, but also something that we are commonly using right now. For example, there are open box LLMs like Llama 2 or like T5. To train them from scratch took a lot of GPUs and a lot of time. And it's also remains a question whether we can really trust the API services because like the cost for, based on my understanding, is still unknown. Like there's no deal with Epic that how much character or how much money they charge per character or like per call if you use their GPT-4 service through the API. And then the third issue is lack of transparency. So that also go back to the unknown, because we don't know what this model is thinking. We don't know what's going on inside. We don't know which attention neuron is actually reacting to the input. So we can't really trust them. And finally, it's the legal and ethical concerns, which I'm not going to get into detail, but I do think that this is something that we might need to keep in mind. So my goal, and also what our lab is focusing on, is trying to build this safe AI in particular for diagnosis generation or diagnosis prediction, which is the main topic of my talk today. And just a little bit spoiler alert, what I'm going to talk about include these keywords. I'm going to include some work on the knowledge graph plus LLM. I'm going to talk about prompting, especially graph prompting for LLM. And also we proposed the first comprehensive human evaluation for safe LLM diagnostic process. Another thing I want to note is that all the experiments we've done in these slides is using ChatGPT. So we have like a agreement with the OpenAI, I think it was actually with Microsoft or Nuance, so that we can use ChatGPT without sharing our data. But we did do a bunch of studies using the open source LLMs, for example, Llama 2 or T5. We did fine tuning them using the current state of the art methods. I just did not include them in this talk, but I'm happy to talk about it if we have time. And now let's revisit the problem. We want to have a safe LLM for diagnosis prediction. And what does that mean? What does a safe LLM mean here? Well, I'm talking about a safe LLM that has a certain level of diagnostic accuracy. It has to be high diagnostic accuracy. And then it can generate a explainable pathways so that we understand how they arrive at conclusion. Finally, we need to evaluate LLM beyond the evaluation metrics we have right now, which is purely based on like the string overlap or just concept overlap, such and such. So that's the main focus of my next couple of slides. And in this work, we focus on something called retrieval augmented generation framework. For some of you who is not familiar with this concept, the idea is that once you have an LLM and which you're not sure whether they have this domain knowledge, then you can utilize an external module and retrieve relevant information from that external module and feed that into the LLM. And the way that we're going to do it here is through a knowledge graph. Well, there are many available large-scale knowledge sources that's underutilized for LLM. For instance, the structured medical knowledge repository from the Unified Medical Language System, which is like a huge knowledge base developed by National Library of Medicine. They provide over millions of like concepts and relations about these medical concepts. And then now I'm showing you what a knowledge graph, like a subgraph, look like utilizing this UMLS nomad concepts and their relations. You can see that we have the source concepts and then the target concepts. So we start with the source concept, and then each pair of concepts, you have a relation which could be considered as an edge between that source and the target. So we have cirrhosis that has a direct neighbor, we call it, which is the target concept connected to cirrhosis as liver cirrhosis and gastrointestinal. And then further, we have gastrointestinal connected to abdominal pain through that relation associated with. And then using this subgraph, this knowledge subgraph, we are able to perform something called multi-hop reasoning, which is we want to start connecting the node cirrhosis with abdominal pain. The reason we can connect them is because there is a hop from cirrhosis to gastrointestinal, and there's also a second hop from gastrointestinal to abdominal pain. Therefore, you are able to retrieve a path from cirrhosis to abdominal pain, even though they're not directly connected. So this is called two hops or multi-hop. The same idea we can apply to cirrhosis, to alcoholic liver cirrhosis, because we have a liver cirrhosis at the middle. So we are able to perform that two hops to reach alcoholic liver cirrhosis. The other thing I want to just make a comment on this figure. So you can see that like some of these relations, they don't really make sense. Like they just show like a concept hierarchy structure. To be able to run or build this knowledge graph for diagnosis prediction purpose, we actually have one subject expert, which is a ICU physician, look at all the relations in the UMLS and pick the one that actually talked about the reasoning semantics or like any semantics about causal relations between the symptoms to the other symptoms. That include, for example, something is caused by something, or something has a temporal relationship with something, meaning that might occur before another symptom or after another symptom. So we focus on small set of the relations rather than all the relations. I think that's important to emphasize, but we did use the entire set of concepts. And now when you look at this figure, then you might wonder, can we just utilizing like this this knowledge graph as it is. And once we have an input, let's say a list of concepts, we just retrieve all the possible knowledge paths and then use that as like the knowledge, relevant knowledge for the LLM. Can we do that? Well, the answer is no, but I'm gonna jump to that next. But I do want to talk about the benefit of doing that. Is the benefit of incorporating knowledge graph with LLM is that we're able to inject the knowledge into knowledge graph models to achieve safer text generation and cheaper in memory and running time. So that's because we're able to model the knowledge graph as a separate module, which is much smaller compared to the size of the LLM. And also more benefits about the KG plus LLM for diagnosis prediction, because like the KG, when you have the multi-hop reasoning, you're able to retrieve that path and you're able to trace down how is this concept related to the other concept? How did I select the path, right? And then also the multi-hop reasoning, as I talked about before. The other thing that I want to note is that the knowledge discovery for rare disease is a benefit, it's a huge benefit for a knowledge graph because it contains all kinds of disease. It doesn't rely on which EHR database that you train on. Like some of the EHR database might only focus on the disease on certain populations, while the others might not contain those disease. So using a knowledge graph, you have the entire space or universe of the concepts. And finally, it's adaptability for heterogeneous data integration. So what does that mean? If we want to combine the medical concepts with other modalities of data, for example, omics or radiology images, then you're able to do that through the knowledge graph because they don't care about whether you're representing them as a string of text, like they're just represented as like node and relations. And now the entire hypothesis of our work is that we might get benefits from like this integration of knowledge graph with the LLM, and maybe we can reach like a win-win situation. So I want to go back to the question I just threw out, which is, can we just simply run the graph traversal algorithm and pull out all the paths given the concept? The answer is no, because when we did a sample calculation on a small sample of the knowledge graph and also like the input, we find that the median numbers of the first hop target nodes is 368, while the average number is 2,000. So what does that mean? There are on average about 2,000 paths that you can pull out given one concept. And that's only one hop. And then given that the knowledge graph is super or highly connected, then you're gonna get exponential growth from the number 2,000 to like 48,000 of the second hop paths. So that's a huge number to traverse. And then it's really nonsense that you pull out all the paths and then fit that into the LLM, right? So the work that I'm going to present today is about, well, if we can have a LLM leverage medical facts from a knowledge graph, can we generate facial diagnosis based on these facts, given a note that describing the patient's status and symptoms, or given a progress note in our case? There are three main research questions listing here. The first step is, how do we retrieve relevant medical knowledge from a knowledge graph? Because there's so many different paths and there's so many different possibilities. And the second question is, how do we effectively incorporate those knowledge into LLM to generate the diagnosis? Finally, how do we measure the diagnostic accuracy in a way that we can measure the safety of this LLM generation? Just another background, I want to show you like the annotation we did on the progress notes from the MIMIC dataset. So for a progress note, it normally follows the SOAP format, whereas it's the subjective sections, it's normally written in natural language that representing or documenting the most recent symptoms or events or the patient's complaint. And then the objective, which is O section, has the medications, laboratory results, vital signs, which is normally represented in the structured data format. And assessment is the most important section in this progress note, which is where like the physicians start to write down the description of the passive and active diagnosis or problems. Like some of them has the diagnosis already. Some of them is just a surface level description over the problems or just like documenting the symptoms. Finally, we have the PE section, which is the plan section. Each plan section has a specific problem and then the treatment to cure that problem. in our annotation, we have SOAP highlighted or like segmented away. And then in particular, we use SOA as input to LLM and let the LLM to generate the diagnosis in the plan sections. And more of the annotation can be found in our paper that's listed at the bottom of the slides. Okay, going back to the methodology of utilizing the knowledge graph, given the input that describing the patient's problems, we're able to pull out the medical concepts. Here is highlighted in this different color, like fever, coughing, sepsis. These are the concepts about the problems or symptoms. So we start with these concepts and we start pulling out the first hop neighbors given these concepts. As you can see, some of this neighbor, which is naturally more relevant to the input than the other. For example, given the sepsis as input, and then we are able to pull out communicable disease or sepsis-associated gastrointestinal hemorrhage, then there's nothing in the input talked about the GI issue, right? So it actually eliminates the possibility of having that sepsis because of the GI issue compared to the communicable disease. Because like fever, coughing, these are commonly seen from the communicable disease like flu or something else. And same with fever. So there are coughing with fever and fever of the newborn. There's nowhere in the input that talks about a newborn or if the patient is pregnant or anything. Therefore, the coughing with fever, which is more relevant given that input compared to the fever of newborn. So based on these more relevant concepts, we're able to perform the second hop. So this is not the same way as we think about a multi-hop where we list all the possible first hop and start the second hop on all of the concepts. We only select the concept that's more relevant to the input at each hop. And then that's what we call like get the top end concepts and then perform the second hop or the third hop on it. And then you can see that for the second hop, we also highlighted the concepts that's most relevant or the top end concepts. Here, like pneumonia and influenza or respiratory distress syndrome are the most likely diagnoses given these patients' problems because they're more relevant to the input. They're also more relevant. They're connected through this knowledge path.
So how do you select the end for the top end?
Good question. Yes, for the audience online, there's a question of asking how do we select the top end? That's an empirical question, and we select it based on the average numbers of diagnoses from each different EHR data set. For example, from the ICU data set, we noticed there are about 4 to 5 active diagnoses per patient or per practice note. So in our experiments, we actually try with top 4 and top 6. Yeah, no problem. And we name it as diagnostic reasoning knowledge graph, which is a graph neural network model that perform this operation, which is to retrieve the top and relevant knowledge paths. Now, just getting a little bit of the technical details, more technical details here. This is showing the doctor notes architecture. So again, given the input that talks about a patient's problems and also the medical concepts, we first convert the input to a input text embeddings or encoding. We also convert the list of input concepts to another embeddings. And then utilizing this starting quiz, what we call, we're able to extract the subgraphs, which is the concepts with their neighbors. Just FYI, the quiz represent the concept unique identifiers. The reason we use concept unique identifiers is because therefore we can map different lexicons that belong to the same concepts into the same ID. For example, fever, there's another way to say that, like fever, high fever or hypoxia. These are different ways to saying the same concepts. And then once we move on to after we're done with extracting the subgraphs, we're able to get all the first hop neighbors, which is showing in that gray dot. We feed these neighbors directly to the graph neural network, where it's trying to learn the concept representation based on the graph hierarchical, along with the contextualized representation they already have from the pre-training language models. And then we move on to the path encoder. So that is for each pair of source and target concepts or each path, we're able to generate an embedding that represents a semantic representation of that path. And then finally, the path ranker, which is one of the most important module here, would actually rank the importance of those paths given the input text representation and also input concept representation. The reason we have both input text representation and concept representation is because sometimes in the text you have negation. For example, you say that the patient has no fever, or you say the patient doesn't have anything, while the concepts only look at the concepts themselves. So you need to have both ways to get a comprehensive representation. And then based on this, the relation of that path, and then also or the relevancy of that path to the input, we're able to assign the importance scores on each of these target output or node and start performing the next hop, which is going through the same process. So in other words, we're not doing a graph traversal based on all the paths. We're trying to do a conditional top-end concept selection to perform the next hop until we reach the end. Here we select most of the path is like 2 hops. In other words, the second hop is the end that one path can reach. That's because in our empirical study, we find that anything that beyond 2 hops start to become a little bit like just artificial or nothing relevant about the input anymore.
What kind of graph neural network in particular are you using?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I have a question asking what kinds of graph neural network it is. I'm actually using something called graph isomorphism network. It's actually proved to be mathematically more powerful than the graph convolutional neural net or graph attention neural net, but more simple.
So is it capable of doing versatility test?
Yes, yes. Yeah, it passed that test. Yeah, that's a good question. So I think I need to speed up a little bit because I have more interesting in the next part of the slides. And I do want to talk about the path ranking. I actually have a slide about the path representation. If we have time, we can get to in my backup slides. But the path ranking is where it starts to show how we design the modules that can exhibit the diagnostic reasoning process. In other words, we ask the question, to what extent does the current knowledge path align with the patient's condition as presented in the input? And we're trying to model the relation between the input text hidden representation, the input concept list representation, and then the candidate path embedding. So to do that, we propose 2 kinds of attention mechanism. One is called multi-attention based on inference modeling. So for any path, and given either text input or the concept list input, we're able to model 3 relations, 3 inference relations. One is neutral, meaning that the path you're selecting or the candidate path doesn't have anything to add to the input. Or it's a contradiction, meaning it just contradicts the fact of the input, while it's an entailment, meaning it actually provides more information about your input. So these 3 relations can be modeled as the interaction between the 2 matrices, which is the input text matrices versus the input path embedding matrices. And another way is we don't specify any of these matrix operation. We just let the attention learn the intricate interaction between these 3 matrices. Here we call it the trilinear attention. So trilinear attention is actually widely used for multimodality attention neural network, for example, vision, text, or audio. And then my experiment results is going to show you the performance difference between these 2 types of attention. And then the other thing is really important to emphasize is we use a compound loss design in our experiment. We use the binary cross entropy loss on the accuracy on the predicted concepts. So the predicted concept is the target concept that path finally lead to. In other words, the ultimate goal of that the selected path that can lead to. And then we also use something called congestive learning loss that has the positive samples and also negative samples to generate the discriminated representation learning on the path. So here the positive samples is the one that start from the concept, source concept and end to the correct target concepts. In other words, the correct path. While the negative input here, we actually use a confined space of negative samples, which is starting from the same source concept, but lead to a completely different target concepts. In this way, you get a smaller representation space where you try to learn the subtle difference between the correct path and then the incorrect path. And the way that we incorporate a knowledge graph into LLM is using this RAG framework, the retrieval augmented generation framework. The step 1 is, given the progress node, we try to identify and retrieve the relevant knowledge paths using these Dr. Knows models. And once we have that, the second step is we went through a sophisticated design of like prompt engineering framework that include like quality estimation of different manual generated prompts. And then finally, we select the final prompt template that incorporate this knowledge path, and then with some few shot examples. And then the third step is we use these few shot examples and the final prompt template to prompt the LLM to predict the diagnosis based on the input progress node and also explain its reasoning. Ultimately, we have a group of physicians evaluating the LLM output based on the input node with or without the knowledge graph path. So we done that studies through the RECAP. And here, what I'm showing you is on the automated metrics evaluation, what is the performance between with or without this knowledge path provided by the Dr. No's models. So we have two settings presented here. One is a prompt-based 0-shot, and the other is the few shot. On the few shot, we have like 3-shot and 5-shot. That's because once we go beyond 5-shot, we actually reach the token limit of ChatGPT. So we didn't go beyond. But just a quick glance, anything that highlighted in the bold font text, meaning the highest performance. So you can see that the highest performance across all settings is coming from the ChatGPT 5-shot with the path. And any green font text is showing there is a significant difference in the confidence interval compared to the baseline settings, which is without the path. A quick summary on this figure is that the ChatGPT with the path as input from the Dr. No's models actually show performance improvement over the ones without. And then another detail is that we're using two different metrics for our results reporting here. One is called Rouge. So Rouge is a conventional summarization evaluation metric based on string overlap. It's based on n-gram overlap. Like we have the bigram, we also have longest subsequence overlap. And then the Courier recall precision and F-score is where we convert the predicted diagnosis as a list of concepts with their identifiers. And we measure the overlap between these quiz. And that's where the F-score is coming from. And now I want to talk about the human evaluation because that is actually a really important piece of our work for safe diagnosis generation. Here, starting from the left-hand side, you can see an example output from the LLM, which start with a list of diagnoses separated by the semicolon. And then you can also see a special token saying reasoning. That is where the ChatGPT is outputting its reasoning about why it thinks these are the diagnoses. For the diagnosis, which is marked in the red color text, we first evaluate the entire diagnosis output based on whether there are any missing diagnoses or if the diagnosis that's missing is because of the evidence is not presented in the input, which is what we call the aleatoric uncertainty or epistemic uncertainty, meaning that the evidence is in the input, but like the ChatGPT or LLM just cannot pick that. So that's about omission and uncertainty. And then we also evaluate for each individual diagnosis, how accurate is that diagnosis, and if that diagnosis sounds plausible or has the right level of specificity. So the level of specificity is, for example, you have a diagnosis from humans saying, well, pneumonia is caused by COVID, for example, but that output diagnosis only saying pneumonia, then it's the right diagnosis, but not at the correct level of specificity. And then we also have abstraction that's measuring whether that diagnosis is directly inferred from the given input, which sometimes include the knowledge graph path, predicted path. And then on the reasoning side, we have the same philosophy where we score the reasoning section as entirety and looking at whether there's any reasoning sentence that's omitted from the output or whether there's any sentence containing abstraction over the input. And finally, for each sentence, we're evaluating whether they have the LLM has the correct recall of knowledge, or they have the correct reasoning, or if they comprehend the evidence correctly. So these are the comprehension, recall, and rationale. The other two things I want to talk about the human evaluation design is that we refer to two important literatures or set of literatures. One is something called SaferDX instruments. So SaferDX instrument is a human survey with 12 questions asking whether there's any missed opportunity for diagnosis. It's actually being advertised as like a clinical practice to detect any diagnostic errors. So you can see that here is a screenshot from Society to Improve Diagnosis in Medicine, like they're advertising this SaferDX instrument. And then the second reference, major reference we designed this human evaluation from is a really exhaustive literature review on the existing LLM clinical text generation evaluation, which include, like factuality, safety, or like some other aspects. We all include that into our human evaluation design. And now some highlights on the human evaluation as overall. We have 4 medical professionals. Well, 2 of them is senior physicians. One of them is resident, and one of them is a last year medical school student. But they all reached the inter-annotator agreement on this human evaluation above 0.8, meaning that they have over 80% of the agreement on the entire human evaluation survey. And then when we evaluate the ChatGPT results with and without the knowledge graph, we have the diagnostic accuracy both above 66%. So this is actually quite high and quite surprising to us. And the subcategories in our human evaluation survey that the knowledge graph has the most impact on is the abstraction and the correct reasoning. So you can see that with knowledge graph input, the levels of abstraction actually bring up from 81% to 87%. And then the correct reasoning bring up from 50% to 55%, both with statistical significance. Now I want to show you an example of what that human evaluation looked like and what the ChatGPT output looked like given the input progress nodes. So the input progress nodes listed on the top, and then the middle is the Dr. Nodes retrieved top 6 knowledge paths. You can see that some of them is like a self loop for the second hop. That's where like that symbol is representing. And then the ground truth diagnosis and also the predicted diagnosis without the path provided and with the path provided. Without the path provided, you can see that the human evaluator actually think they're not plausible diagnoses. While with the path, the ChatGPT can actually utilize the information, for example, like pneumonia or like communicable disease, and then make it as a plausible diagnosis. And in this second example, where we show on the reasoning section, without a knowledge path, like the clinician didn't think that reasoning makes sense. So it's not a correct reasoning. However, with the knowledge path provided, especially like the text that I highlighted in the green color, is where ChatGPT say how they utilize the knowledge graph. It actually turned that reasoning to be a correct reasoning evaluated by the clinicians. Finally, just an error analysis example showing where the errors come from right now. And one big problem is the negation that I was talking about. Like in the input progress node, the allergy is no non-drug allergies. However, in the Dr. Nodes retrieve path, you can see that drug allergy is actually being listed as one of the paths. Same with the consulting procedure. There's a second type of errors where we have the correct path predicted by Dr. Nodes. This is a pure extraction path. However, the ChatGPT is not able to pick up that path, even though it's provided in that input. So finally, I want to conclude my talk with some future room for improvement. We think, for example, we definitely need to improve the accuracy from Dr. Nodes and also bring more explainability, for example, to test how reliable the reasoning section is. And secondly, I do think that using a RAG framework with an external knowledge base can pave the way for explainable AI decision support. And I'm happy to hear about your thoughts. And finally, I think that multimodality LLM is definitely the next or the near future for healthcare. So right now we only focus on the text, but at some point we want to bring in more data modality, for example, the genomics data or like the structured data that's in the progress nodes. And ultimately, physician-centered evaluation is where the way to go, because we don't care how the automatic metrics think. We care about how clinicians feel about this technology and whether they think it's correct. Finally, a round of applause to all of my collaborators, co-authors. Also, thank LLM for supporting my research. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have now.
Great presentation. Any questions from the audience?
Thanks so much for a really great talk. I'm interested in just because how variable notes can be, especially from institution to institution. Like, I feel like my residency notes were written completely much more structured than coming here. It's like a very different format. You mentioned using Mimic, and it sounded like some other sites too. Do they all kind of use a standardized set, or how does it work when you apply it to like a really atypically formatted notes? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So let me repeat that for the online audience. The question is, how did I handle like the different documentation practice across different institutions? So we actually did train our models on both Mimic dataset and also our UW Health internal database. And it turns out that UW Health has more extractive concepts than the Mimic. I think like the idea of our method is we only looked at the concepts, the list of concepts. Essentially, we only pull out the list of concepts. So as long as we have kind of like a standardized format of like SOAP or AOSP, like that's for some of the institutions, how they document progress notes, we're fine with that. And I also want to mention the fact that we're not just, well, the work I'm presenting, it's only taking progress note as input, but this could be applied to any other text. As long as your input text, it's about the patient's symptoms or other descriptions, then we're able to come up, like Dr. Knowles will be able to generate the possible diagnosis pathway for whatever that given input is. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Can you go back to the slide where you have the knowledge paths that you added to the GPT?
Is the architecture or?
The Yeah, so I'm just curious why are you extracting the knowledge passes? And then you add the knowledge pass to the prompts, right?
Yeah.
So what exactly does it look like? Do you have a section in the prompt that says here are the knowledge passes that you should look at and should put in your song or something else?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Let me repeat that to online. The question is asking how is the knowledge path was integrated to the prompt. Let me show you this example in my backup slide. So we have the task prompt that's from a manual crafted prompt database. And then through a really multiple levels of like quality estimation to get to this point, like the raw prompt doesn't look like this at all. And then we have the input progress note, which is the assessment, started with the assessment and then subjective sections. And then we have the graph model output, which is start with these are knowledge paths. And then we have the first path, which is about white blood cell count to leukocytosis, so on and so forth. And then you can see that we say in the input prompt that first of all, start with the personal, which is imagine you are a medical professional equipped with a knowledge graph. Keep in mind the knowledge graph might be noisy. We actually tested just fit the knowledge graph in, and then it turns out ChatGPT just pull out whatever knowledge graph has. So it does take us a little bit time to get to whatever the test prompt is right now. Yeah.
Yeah, and once you have those knowledge passes in the prompt, how do you make sure that ChatGPT or GPT you're using uses them? As I see from the results, some of the passes actually not used, right? So,
yeah.
And also, if you run it multiple times with the same prompt, did it use the same set of the knowledge paths that you supplied it to?
Yeah. So let me repeat that question. The question is, well, how do we make sure that ChatGPT can pick up the knowledge path even though it's inside the input? The answer is we can be sure that it definitely would use that path. That's actually one of our error, one type of error that we identify, which is like, well, the problem is with ChatGPT, not us. So, but yeah, we're still on our way to figure out that how do we really enforce ChatGPT to do that. But I do want to talk about another possibility if it's not with ChatGPT, which is only provided in the API service, which is if we have the open source LLM, you're able to do kind of like instruction tuning to force it to utilize the path as part of the its answer generation. Then we have less of problem there.
But I think even with the instruction tuning, you might get into the issues that, because I tried it myself. Sometimes I just wanted to pick a few things from the list that I supplied to it. And I'm very explicit on that task, and it generates things that are not in the list.
Yeah.
Despite I tried multiple times.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess following up on that, just again with the sort of variability, even if you give GPT, the same prompt, the same tasks, and then to get you a bunch of different answers. I'm sorry if I missed this in your slides. In sort of the examples where you had the physicians review, different cases, did you have some number of replicates for each case? Just again, because it can generate something totally out of left field one time, even 4 times it generates something that's reasonable.
Yeah, that's a good question. So what the question was asking about whether we have the replicates in the human evaluation. The answer is no, but we did that step in our prompt engineering framework, where given that that's the raw prompt, which is not this test prompt to start with, we actually run something called self-consistency, which is we run the same prompt and the same input multiple times. And then we measure whether that prompt can lead to a accuracy or performance that's in the really high variations or low variation. And then we pick the one that has the high performance and low variation. And then with the same parameter setting. So in that way, we can make sure at least when we have the prompt, it's doing something that it's supposed to do. Yeah, yeah. But not on the human evaluation side, because it's so expensive to perform the human evaluation. Yeah.
Great. Any further questions from the audience? Great. Let's thank our speaker again.
Yeah, thank you.